With the premiere of the Mandalorian series, we've all been obsessing about Baby Yoda and how cute it is. So, babies are young, so that got me thinking this would be an opportunity to talk about the youngest countries in the world. The Baby Yodas of political geography. We always talk about countries that might exist, independence movements, etc. But what about the ones that actually managed to recently affirm their independence and sovereignty? In this video, we're going to take a look at the most recently formed countries in the world. So let's get started. I'll go continent by continent, starting with Europe. Usually referred by Europeans as the old continent, Europe has a surprising number of young countries, but this doesn't keep it from being old. A lot of these countries, and not only in Europe, might be recent in their current form, but their national identities have been around for a long time, even sometimes existing as previous states, which for some reason temporarily lost their independence until today. Armenia is a great example of this, and I actually mentioned them in a recent video as one of the oldest countries in the world, having existed throughout history in many forms and through many states. But their current form was only achieved in 1991. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Armenia, which had existed as a puppet Soviet state, recovered its sovereignty. The first country to recognize them was Greece, followed by the United States. Europe has a lot of recent countries because of the political changes that took place at the end of the 20th century. With the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of countries in Eastern and Central Europe recovered their full sovereignty, and most of these, if not all, had already existed for a long time before Soviet occupation. Between 1990 and 1991, their independence was restored. The first one was Lithuania in 1990, but in the next months, all the others followed. In Europe, the last ones to regain independence were Armenia itself in 91, and Azerbaijan and Moldova a month before. The same happened with the dismantling of Yugoslavia in the same year, with 7 new states eventually being created from that territory. The first to break away was Croatia, recovering independence in June of 1991, and the last was Bosnia in 92. Eventually, all of Yugoslavia fell apart, with Serbia and Montenegro being the only 2 countries that stuck together, but not permanently, as we will see in a minute. 2 more countries emerged in 1993 with the separation of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic, now Czechia, and Slovakia. Czechoslovakia regained their sovereignty from the Soviets in 1989, but they soon realized they wanted to be 2 countries instead of 1, and so in 1993 they separated. The reasons for separation sort of date back to their belonging to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the fact that 2 different nationalities exist, Czechs and Slovaks, as well as the fact that Slovaks felt under Czech rule during Soviet times, instead of just being cooperating states. So, with a mutually agreed separation, Europe gained 2 new countries just under 30 years ago. 2 other countries that existed together and then separated as well were Serbia and Montenegro in 2006. Although calling Serbia a new country seems kind of strange because they've been around for so long. It's just that since 1992 until 2006, Serbia and Montenegro existed as 1 country. So technically, upon their separation, 2 new countries were created. But essentially what happened is that Montenegro broke away from Serbia. They had a referendum in 2006 and 55.5% voted for independence. A narrow vote, especially since the EU, who acted as a verifying agent, required a 55% majority for the result to be valid. However, despite achieving their current independence very recently, Montenegro had also already had sovereignty before, as a principality and as a kingdom since 1852 until 1918. And then, one whose status as a country is somewhat disputed. Only 51% of the countries part of the UN have recognized its sovereignty. Kosovo, which achieved independence in 2008, being the most recent region in Europe to do so. Kosovo became an autonomous region of Serbia in 1945, still part of Yugoslavia, gaining status as their own province in 1968. So, throughout the 20th century, there was an increasing process towards full independence. They declared it in 1990, but were only supported by Albania. Finally, in 2008, after years of conflict, a new declaration of independence was more successful, with more support from other countries and part of the international community, despite their sovereignty still not being a worldwide consensus. Next, we move to Asia, the youngest country in Asia, and one of the youngest in the world is East Timor. East Timor started off as a Portuguese colonial possession in the 16th century, but in 1975, they declared independence. However, full sovereignty wasn't immediately achieved. 9 days later, after the declaration of independence, they were occupied by Indonesia, and after decades of resistance, the UN was able to intervene and hold a verified referendum referendum in 1999, where independence won with 78% of the votes. Full independence arrived in 2002, and today it is one of the only two predominantly Christian countries in Asia, along with the Philippines. Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan also emerged with the fall of the Soviet Union. There's not much to say about the independence processes of these four. Essentially, as the USSR dissolved itself, its various members declared their sovereignty as independent states, no longer under Soviet influence, although some maintained similar types of regimes even until today. These are examples of that, achieving independence in 1991. Moving to Africa, the whole of Africa had its independence fairly late, with a lot of countries only achieving it in the 20th century. But which were the last ones to get independence? These were ones that did not get their independence from their former European colonizers, but rather which gained sovereignty by separating from some other African nation. Eritrea is an example of that, having separated from Ethiopia. It has existed since very early in history, but their current status of independence was achieved in 1993. It was colonized by Italy, but in 1944, after being liberated from Italian rule, the Ethiopian Empire claimed it. Later, independence resulted from a war against the former rulers, Ethiopia, which lasted from 1961 to 1991. In the middle of that war, Ethiopia fell into a civil war, and after that, Eritrea was able to hold an independence referendum, which won almost unanimously. Namibia has a similar story. After being a German colony, it became a South Africa Mandate region. With the rise of self-determination and an ongoing conflict between the locals and South Africa, the UN declared in 1968 that the region should be renamed from Southwest Africa to Namibia, and that South African occupation was illegal. However, the conflict continued, and only in 1990, after a one-year-long transition period, was a ceasefire and later independence achieved. And finally, in Africa, South Sudan, which is until today the youngest country in the world. It gained independence from the Republic of Sudan in 2011, making it the most recent sovereign state with international recognition. In that very year, a referendum was held, and 98% of the population voted for independence. The reason why they wanted independence was apparently the big differences between the populations of the North and South. The North is mostly Muslim, while the South is more diverse and has a lot of Christian people. Certain disputes remained, including the division of oil revenues, as 75% of all former Sudan's oil reserves are in South Sudan. Today, the country is involved in a bad internal conflict, but remains as the youngest country in the world. Then America. Despite being a country which was colonized by Europe, and whose countries pretty much all descend from European colonies, it surprisingly isn't up high on the list of young countries, with the majority of them having reached their independence a fairly long time ago. Only a few, mostly in the Caribbean islands where European powers were able to make their sovereignty last the longest, do we have a few examples, like St. Kitts and Nevis, which became independent in 1983. It used to be a British colony, gradually gaining autonomy in the 20th century, eventually declaring full independence, but still having the British Queen as head of state. Interestingly, Nevis, the other island of the archipelago, recently voted for independence in 1998, with 61% of the people wanting independence. But rules called for a two-thirds majority, so it didn't happen. Antigua and Barbuda have a pretty much identical process. They were a British colony, gaining more and more sovereignty until reaching full independence in 1981, opting to keep the British Queen as their sovereign as well. And finally, Oceania, which has a somewhat similar situation to America in the sense that independence was achieved a long time ago for most of the lands. It is only in some small islands that new countries still fight for independence. The most recent example of this is Palau. Palau belonged to the Trust Territory that the US managed after the Japanese lost their Pacific Empire. When it was transformed into the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau didn't want to join. Instead, they declared independence with the support of the Philippines, Taiwan, and Japan. However, they signed a compact of free association with the US, making it an American associated state, although it is independent since 1994. So, to wrap it up, here is the top 10 of the youngest countries in the world across all continents. From bottom to top: Slovakia, Czech Republic, Eritrea, Palau, East Timor, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and South Sudan. But other countries might soon take away South Sudan's record and place as the world's youngest country. For instance, Bougainville, an autonomous region of Papua New Guinea, literally just voted for independence this month, and independence won with 98.31% of the votes. Independence hasn't been declared or consolidated, but it should be sometime soon. And other regions of the world, which we've covered extensively already in previous videos, might soon get independence as well, although in some cases, the referendums might not be so easy to secure, like Scotland or Quebec, both of which had independence referendums somewhat recently, with no winning by very small margins, meaning there are still big parts of the local populations who would apparently prefer being independent. So who knows, maybe in a few months I'll have to do an update video to include new countries on this list. But for now, those are the youngest countries in the world. Their national identities in some cases go back centuries and centuries, but their countries in the current form were only created recently, most of them in the past 20 to 30 years, and some in the past decade. Thank you for watching this video. As always, subscribe if you haven't yet, and if you would like to watch future videos. Speaking of those future videos, I have a lot of ideas, but I'm always looking for suggestions from you guys, so leave a comment below on which countries, flags, or just topics in general you would like to watch me talk about. I will see you next time for more general knowledge.